Granny Cornwall's Storytime. The Wind in the Willows by Kenneth Grahame. Chapter 3. The Wild Wood. The mole had long wanted to make the acquaintance of the badger. He had seemed, by all accounts, to be such an important personage, and though rarely visible, to make his unseen influence felt by everybody about the place. But whenever the mole mentioned his wish to the water rat, he always found himself put off. "It's all right," the rat would say. "Badger will turn up some day or another. He's always turning up, and then I'll introduce him. The best of fellows. But you must not only take him as you find him, but when you find him." "Couldn't you ask him here dinner or something?" said the mole. "He wouldn't come," replied the rat simply. "Badger hates society and invitations and dinner and all that sort of thing." "Well then, supposing we go and call on him," suggested the mole. "Oh, I'm sure he wouldn't like that at all," said the rat, quite alarmed. "He's very shy. He'd sure to be offended. I've never even ventured to call on him at his own home myself, though I know him so well. Besides, we can't. It's quite out of the question, because he lives in the middle of the wild wood." "Well, supposing he does," said the mole. "You told me the wild wood was all right, you know." "Oh, I know, so it is," replied the rat evasively, "but I think we won't go there just now. Not just yet. It's a long way, and he wouldn't be at home at this time of year anyway. And he'll be coming along some day, if you'll wait quietly." The mole had to be content with this, but the badger never came along, and every day brought its amusements, and it was not till summer was long over, and cold and frost and miry ways kept them much indoors, and the swollen river raced past outside the windows with a speed that mocked at boating or any sort or kind, he found his thoughts dwelling again with much persistence on the solitary grey badger who lived his own life by himself in his hole in the middle of the wildwood. In the winter, Rat slept a great deal, retiring early and rising late. During his short day, he sometimes scribbled poetry or did other small domestic jobs about the house, and of course there were always animals dropping in for a chat, and consequently there was a good deal of storytelling and comparing notes on the summer past and all its doings. Still, the mole had a good deal of spare time on his hands, and so one afternoon, when wrapped in his armchair before the blazing fire was alternately dozing and trying over rhymes that wouldn't fit, he formed the resolution to go out by himself and explore the wildwood, and perhaps strike up an acquaintance with Mr. Badger. It was a cold, still afternoon, with a hard, steely sky overhead when he slipped out of the warm parlour and into the open air. The country lay bare and entirely leafless around him, and he thought he'd never seen so far and so intimately into the insides of things as on that winter day, when nature was deep in her annual slumber and seemed to have kicked the clothes off. Copses, dells, quarries, and all hidden things which had been mysterious mines for exploration in leafy summer now exposed themselves. Mole was glad that he liked the country undecorated, hard and stripped of its finery. He had got down to the bare bones of it, and they were fine and strong and simple. He did not want the warm clover and the play of the seeding grasses. The screens of quickset, the billowy drapery of beech and elm seemed best away, and with a great cheerfulness of spirit he pushed on towards the wildwood, which lay before him low and threatening like a black reef in a still southern sea. There was nothing to alarm him at first entry. Twigs crackled under his feet, logs tripped him, funguses on stumps resembled caricatures and startled him for the moment by their likeness to something familiar and far away. But that was all fun and exciting. It led him on, and he penetrated to where the light was less, and the trees crouched nearer and nearer, and holes made ugly mouths to him on either side. Everything was very still now. The dusk advanced on him steadily, rapidly, gathering in behind and before, and the light seemed to be draining away like flood water. Then the faces began. It was over his shoulder and indistinctly that he first thought he saw a face, a little evil wedge-shaped face, looking out at him from a hole. When he turned and confronted it, the thing had vanished. He quickened his pace, telling himself cheerfully not to begin imagining things, or there'd be simply no end to it. He passed another hole, and another, and another, and then, yes, no, yes. Certainly a little narrow face with hard eyes had flashed up for an instant from the hole and was gone. He hesitated, braced himself up for an effort and strode on. Then suddenly, as if it had been so all the time, every hole, far and near, and there were hundreds of them, seemed to possess its face, coming and going rapidly, all fixing on him glances of malice and hatred, all hard-eyed and evil and sharp. If he could only get away from the holes in the banks, he thought, there'd be no more faces. He swung off the path and plunged into the untrodden places of the wood. Then the whistling began. Very faint and shrill it was, and far behind it when first he heard it, but somehow it made him hurry forward. Then, still very faint and shrill, it sounded far ahead of him, and made him hesitate and want to go back. As he halted in indecision, it broke out on either side and seemed to be caught up and passed on throughout the whole length of the wood to its farthest limit. They were up and alert and ready, evidently, whoever they were, and he was alone and unarmed and far from any help, and the night was closing in. Then the pattering began. He thought it was only falling leaves at first, so slight and delicate was the sound of it. Then as it grew, it took a regular rhythm, and he knew it for nothing else but the pat, pat, pat of little feet still a long way off. Was it in front or behind? It seemed to be first one and then the other, then both. It grew and it multiplied, till from every quarter, as he listened anxiously, leaning this way and that, it seemed to be closing in on him. As he stood still to listen, a rabbit came running hard towards him through the trees. He waited, expecting it to slacken pace or to swerve from him into a different course. Instead, the animal almost brushed him as it dashed past, its face set and hard eyes staring. "Get out of this, you fool! Get out!" the mole heard him mutter as he swung round a stump and disappeared down a friendly burrow. The pattering increased till it sounded like a sudden hail on the dry leaf carpet spreading around him. The whole wood seemed running now, running hard, hunting, chasing, closing in around something or somebody. In panic, he began to run too, aimlessly. He knew not whither. He ran up against things, he fell over things and into things. He darted under things and dodged around things. At last he took refuge in a deep, dark hollow of an old beech tree, which offered shelter, concealment, perhaps even safety, but who could tell? Anyhow, he was too tired to run any further and could only snuggle down into the dry leaves which had drifted into the hollow and hope he was safe for a time. And as he lay there panting and trembling, and listened to the whistlings and the patterings outside. He knew at last in all its fullness that dread thing which other little dwellers in field and hedgerow had encountered here and known as their darkest moment, that thing which the rat had vainly tried to shield him from, the terror of the wild wood. Meantime the rat, warm and comfortable, dozed by his fireside. His paper of half-finished verses slipped from his knee, his head fell back, his mouth open, and he wandered by the verdant banks of dream rivers. Then a coal slipped, the fire crackled, and sent up a spurt of flame, and he woke with a start. Remembering what he'd been engaged upon, he reached down to the floor for his verses, pored over them for a minute, and then looked around for Mole to ask him if he knew a good rhyme for something or another. But the Mole was not there. He listened for a time. The house was very quiet. Then he called Moley for several times, and receiving no answer, got up and walked out into the hall. The Mole's cap was missing from its accustomed peg. His galoshes, which always lay up by the umbrella stand, were also gone. The rat left the house and carefully examined the muddy surface of the ground outside, hoping to find the Mole's tracks. There they were, sure enough. Their galoshes were new, just bought for the winter, and the pimples on their soles were fresh and sharp. He could see the imprints of them in the mud, running along straight and purposeful, leading direct to the wild wood. The rat looked very grave and stood in deep thought for a moment or two. Then he re-entered his house, strapped a belt around his waist, shoved a brace of pistols into it, took up a stout cudgel that stood at the corner of the hall, and set off for the wildwood at a smart pace. It was already getting towards dusk when he reached the first fringe of trees and plunged without hesitation into the wood, looking anxiously on either side for any sign of his friend. Here and there, wicked little faces popped out of holes, but vanished immediately at the sight of Rat, his pistols, and the great ugly cudgel in his grasp, and the whistling and the pattering, which he had heard quite plainly on his first entry, died away and ceased, and all was very still. He made his way manfully through the length of the wood to its furthest edge. Then, forsaking all paths, he set himself to traverse it, laboriously working over the whole ground, and all the time calling out cheerfully, "Moley, Moley, Moley, where are you? It's me, it's old Rat."